In this video, I'll demonstrate how to insert, update, and delete data in a database. I trust that you've already taken the time to read the lesson text for Lesson 19. It explains that while data binding is convenient, it's not always useful for every scenario when building applications. There will be situations where we'll want more flexibility on how we update and delete data and display data for that matter. So we'll need a more professional approach to retrieving and manipulating data in a database. Additionally, you'll find out more information about the command object, the parameters collection, and the parameter objects that we'll use in this video. So I really recommend that you take a few moments, if you haven't done so already, to read the lesson text for Lesson 19. So after you've done that, we can now demonstrate the use of those techniques in our example application, which I've called, as you see before you, Lesson 19. And this example is going to be rather large, so rather than watching me write each and every line of code, then configuring all the properties on a form and so on, instead I'm going to stop the recording at certain points and do some work and then start recording again. I'll probably do a lot of pasting of code in as well, and I'll explain what I just did and why I did it. Now, what I'm going to do, the purpose of this application will be to manipulate data in the shippers table of the Northwind database. We've been using the customers table of the Northwind database up to this point, but what we're going to do is create an application that will allow us to find one shipper record, delete the record, update the record, or create a new record in the shippers table. So the first thing I'm going to do is paste some controls that I've already got from another instance of Visual Studio running. And let's talk about how the application will work. It really performs a couple of different functions. The first one will be that we can type in the shipper ID and then click the Find button. And when we do that, we'll retrieve all the information that is associated with that shipper ID, namely the company name and the phone number. Now, let's take a quick look at the shipper table so you can get a better idea of the information we'll be working with. My application will closely mirror the shippers table, which I chose because it only had 3 fields. It has a shipper ID, a company name, and a phone number for each shipper. I'm going to double click the shipper table and view all the records in that table. So we should be able to insert, update, and delete records in this table. In order to delete, I'll go ahead and enter a shipper ID, and I can even click the Find, and then when I click the Delete button, it'll eliminate that record from the database. If I want to make a change to a particular record of data, all I need to do is just change either the company name or the phone number and then click the Save button. Or I can click the New button, it'll clear out all the fields, and then allow me to type in a new company name and phone number, and again I'll click the Save button. And this will save a new record into the database. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add a new item to my project. I'm going to select a component. Now a component is exactly the same as a class, as you'll see here in a moment, but it has a visual interface that I can drag and drop things onto. So I'm going to call this shipper.cs and click Open. Or actually I'm going to name this shippers and then click Open. Okay. So this has a visual interface that I can drag and drop items onto, and so let's go over here and go to our Data tab within our toolbox and drop an OLE-DB connection, or I could go and use our little shortcut and get a pre-configured connection, which is the way I'm going to go about it. And I'm going to change the name of this to something that's a little more user-friendly, like just con for connection. Then the next thing I'm going to do is go to my toolbox and drag and drop a command onto the visual surface. And what I'll do with this command is allow the selection of a record from the database. So whenever we hit the Find button, it'll use this command to then grab one row of data from the database and allow me to display it on my form. So let's first of all rename this to something friendlier like CMD select. Okay? The first thing that I want to do is to associate it with a connection, the only connection I have so far, the con object. And then I want to go to my command text, click my ellipsis, And then I'm going to see my familiar query builder. If you've been following along in the lessons, I'm going to select the shippers table. And from here, what I'm going to do is select all shippers from the shippers table. I'm going to type in a custom where clause. Okay, now what does this line of code do? It's going to allow me to refine how many records I bring back from the database. Instead of bringing back the entire table, I only want to select one shipper, the one that matches a parameter that I'm going to pass in. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about parameters in just a moment, but they work a lot like arguments or parameters to the methods that you've written up to this point. So for example, I can pass in the number 2 in code, and or whatever the user types into that text box. I'll take that value, I'll give it to this command, and then it'll return that shipper ID, including the company name and the phone number, back to the user so I can display it on the form. So that's the purpose of a where clause, to refine or to limit the number of records that are brought back. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to repeat this for another command object that I'm going to rename cmd delete. And this command will be in charge of deleting records from the database. So let's go ahead and configure this to use our connection object. And then we'll go to our command text and click the ellipsis, select our shippers table. Now I don't want a select statement this time, I want a delete statement. So what I can do is either type in the delete statement here, or I can get a little bit of help by selecting change type and selecting delete. How did I get to this? I right-clicked within the white area of the design pane of my query builder and selected the delete command. Now you'll notice that it changed the appearance of this view as well as the rest of the views. And here I want to type in my where clause again. It's very important that you use where clauses with delete statements. If you do not use a where clause, you will delete all of the rows from the database. So take extreme caution whenever you're working with delete or update statements, because they can be very destructive to your data. In fact, you should probably leave that to somebody who's a little more trained working with databases when you're first getting started, especially if you started a new company and you're not familiar with how they do their database work. So let's put this where shipper ID equals and click OK. So we only want to delete one row from our shippers table, thus the where clause. And then we'll do this one more time, and this time we're going to do it for the insert. So we're going to call this cmd insert. And we're going to configure our connection. Then go to our command text, select shippers, click add, click close. I'm going to change this from a selection query to an insert into query. Now in order to save a little bit of time, I've already typed this out and I know that it works, so I'm going to just paste in some SQL code that will instruct how to do the insert. We're going to insert into the shipper table two fields, the company name and the phone. The values that will go into those two columns are the company name and the phone number parameters that we'll pass in. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And I'll click Save. Now I'll also need an update command. However, I'm going to choose to not do that visually, but instead I'll only use code just to show you a different approach to writing your data access. We won't use any visual designers whatsoever, no configuration, we'll do it all in code. So now, like I said before, a component is just like a class file, except that it has a visual interface. So I'm just going to double click on this visual interface, and this should give me a code view, and it does. Now notice that this is public class shippers, and it does have some extra code in here that we wouldn't see had we just created a class file. However, that's to accommodate that visual designer. So I'm not going to touch any of the existing code. I'm going to go down to after this little component designer generated code section, and this is where I'll start adding my code. So what do I want to do here? Well, I basically want my shipper component to be a close reflection of the table, the shippers table in the Northwind database. So I'll have 3 private fields for shipper ID, company name, and phone, and then I'll have 3 public methods for shipper ID, company name, and phone that will closely mirror the database. And so what I'm about to paste in here should look very, very familiar to you. Here we've got 3 private fields with each of their values initialized, and then 3 public properties that utilize those private fields, those private member variables. The next thing I need to do is to make sure that, since I'm going to be doing some database access, that I have the namespaces that I'll need for that task. So I'm going to just import system.data and system.data.oledb. Okay, go ahead and save that. Now, the very first thing that I want to enable in my application is that whenever I click the Find button, it'll take whatever number that the user has entered into the shipper ID text box, and it goes to the database and tries to retrieve the record that matches that shipper ID. So let's go ahead and enable a new method within our class called getShipper. Again, I'm not taking the time to type all this out. While you watch, I'm just going to paste in the code. So let's take a look at each of the lines of code here. First of all, public void, so we're not expecting any return value. Public void getShipper, and I'm going to pass in, or accept rather, a shipper ID. So the very first thing I want to do is open our connection to our database. At the very end, you'll notice that I close the connection to the database. Then I use my cmd select. This was the command that I configured to select one row from the shipper table. And you remember that I added a where clause with a parameter called @shipper ID. So here I'm going to access a collection of parameters, so cmd.parameters, and I'm going to work with one parameter in particular, the shipper ID parameter, and I'm going to set its value, .value, equal to the shipper ID, which was passed into our method. So I want to pass to my Access database a SQL query, and I want to change one little thing about that query before I pass it in. I want to substitute the parameter, that little placeholder, the @shipper ID, with some value that my user types in to my visual interface, to this little text field right here. So I'm going to pass that along. I'm going to create a data reader, which we looked at 2 lessons ago, and I'm going to use my command objects execute reader method to get a bookmark to the result set that's sitting in my database, and then I'm going to read each record from the database. Now this should only return one record, but I'm going to keep this syntax here. I'm going to continue to read, and I should never get more than one record, but this is just a very easy way to implement this reading from a database. Now here you'll notice that I use my 3 private fields, my 3 private member variables, and what I'll do is use my data reader and access one field within the data reader, the shipper ID, and here I want to modify it. This will return me back an object, which is the most generic of all data types. And I need to cast this to type integer in order for me to put it into my my private member variable shipper ID. If I don't include this little cast, this little open parenthesis int close parenthesis, then I'll get an error whenever I try to run my application. It'll say that you can't just automatically cast an object into an integer. Same thing is true with the other two lines of code, which allow me to capture the company name and the phone number. I have to cast them to strings. So after we've looped through one time through our data reader, then we'll close the data reader and again close the connection, and we should be all set, right? Well, let's go ahead and test our application. Well, hold on a second now. We need to do one more thing, I guess. Just because we've written this getShipper method doesn't mean that we've hooked it up to our visual interface. So let's go ahead and double-click our Find button. And I double-click the Form 1 load, and the first thing I'm going to do is paste in a line of code that allows me to create an instance of my shippers component, my shippers class. Why am I doing that outside of my btn find or my form load? Well, it's because I want to maintain state. I want this object to stay alive longer than it would be scoped if I were to just do it within this method or this method. I want this to be available to me across all of the methods within this form class, Form 1. So I declare it here outside of the scope of just the methods, so it has a more global scope at the class level. So this gives me an instance of my shippers class, which is what I want to work with. Okay. Then also here in the form load, I'm going to enable some state management. As the application starts up, I'm going to take my delete button and my save button and disable them so they're grayed out. So somebody can't accidentally hit these buttons when it doesn't make sense for them to even be working with those buttons. And so we'll enable those buttons as we have a record selected after we click our Find button. And now I'll paste some code into our btn find click event. Here, notice that I create a new instance of the shipper object. Now I just did that here, but because of the nature of this btn find, I want to pretty much empty out anything that might already be in the shipper. So say for example I type in the number 2 and click find. It's going to give me a shipper object for that second record, but then I want to reuse that object if somebody were to type in the number 3 and click find. So that's why I'm basically renewing the shippers class and getting a new instance of a blank shipper object. Then the very first thing that I do here is I call that new shipper method that I just created, passing in whatever the user typed into the txt shipper ID text box. Of course, in order to get this to work, because text box is going to return a string and I need to pass an integer in to the getShipper method, I need to parse that into an integer. And then, assuming that I was able to find that or retrieve that record from the database, then I'm going to use my shipper object, the property for the shipper ID, for the company name, and for the phone, and put them into the appropriate text boxes on my form. And then finally, like I said just a moment ago, now that I have a record loaded into my form, I can enable the delete button because now I have an option that can actually be deleted. I'm still going to keep the save button disabled for the time being until somebody makes a change to one of the fields of information. So now that we've done that, let's try to run it. I know this is going to break, but at least we can get a little way and it'll open up another item of discussion. Okay, we get an exception like I anticipated, and it says an OLEDB parameter with parameter name shipper ID is not contained by this OLEDB parameter collection. Okay, so basically when we got to this line of code where we wanted to work with a single parameter, it says, sorry, I never saw this parameter before, I don't know what you're talking about. So one of the things that we have to do is go to our command object and tell it what parameters it should expect. Now, just merely typing in the command text and using our @ symbol and giving it a name of shipper ID, that's not good enough. that is not parsed by our little property window here into a parameter collection. So what we'll do instead is we'll click the little ellipsis here, and this will give us an OLEDB parameter collection editor. And I'm just going to add a new parameter. I'm going to change that, the parameter name to @ShipperID. And I think that's all. Oh, I want to also make this into an integer. And I'm going to click OK. So now I'm going to try and run the application, and it should work. Great. You'll notice that it brought back the record that has shipper ID number 2, which would be United Package, and there's its phone number. Excellent. So let me go ahead and close this for now. So now I should really go back through all of my command objects and set the parameter collection appropriately. So let's go into our delete, and we'll add a new parameter, shipper ID. I just so happen to remember the names of the parameters for each of the command objects. So again, this needs to be an integer. And then for our insert command, now there will actually be 2 parameters here that we'll have to use. Let's see. The first one will be company name, and I'm going to leave it as a var wchar. And the second one should be phone, and hopefully that'll work. If not, we'll have to come back and fix that. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is get our save button to work so that we can make a change and then click save and have it save back into the database. So let's go back into our shippers component, and we're going to add some more methods here. We're going to create a public void save shipper. And so what this is going to do is delegate the responsibility of either inserting a shipper or updating a shipper based on the value of the shipper ID. So if the shipper ID is 0, meaning that we just typed in information about the shipper, that could only mean one thing, that we're trying to insert a new shipper. But what if this value were the number 2? Well, we can infer from that that we're talking about updating an existing shipper. So we're going to have 2 methods. Now they're going to look similar, but they're going to call different commands. So let's go ahead and implement another method. Okay, I pasted in a new private method this time. So this is going to encapsulate how our shipper object actually works internally. So private void insert shipper, and notice what I do. First of all, I use the CMD insert, our insert command object. I reference its parameters collection, and you'll remember we added 2 parameters into that collection editor, company name and phone. So we want to specify one parameter in particular, the company name parameter, and set its value equal to the value that's been placed in the private member variable company name through the use of our mutator, our property company name. The same thing would be true then with the parameter called phone. We want to set its value equal to our private member variable phone. Then we will open the connection. I'm going to create a variable called rows effector. Remember, one of our best practices was that even though I don't need to necessarily look at values that are returned from methods, I should still collect those values. And so that's what I do in this case. Execute non-query will return back to me the number of rows that are impacted by by the query that will execute from the command. So we would expect one row to be affected, one row to be inserted into our table. We're just going to ignore it for now, but I could do a little check and make sure that exactly one row was inserted and 5 weren't inserted or 0 weren't inserted. If that were to be the case, then maybe I would raise a red flag and say, ooh, there's a problem here, you know, something went wrong. But we're not going to do that for right now. Then finally, we're going to be responsible and close our connection. Now that takes care of our insert shipper, but what happens if we want to update a shipper? Recall that we did not add a command object for update to the Visual Design Surface. Instead, I said I'm going to just type it all out and show you that there's another way to actually to work with commands, and that would be purely in code with no visual designers, and this would probably be the way that you would do it from this point on. Especially if you're writing more corporate level or professional applications. And the reason is because it gives you a little bit more control than using the visual editors. Okie doke. So here we go. First of all, we create a new instance of an OLEDB command called cmdupdate equal to new OLEDB command. Now I'm going to set some properties of our new command. We're going to set its connection equal to our connection object. So I can still use the connection object. I can still reference it even though I didn't use a visual control. I can still reference the connection, which is a visual control. Not a big deal. It still works all the same. I'm going to set the command type. Now, right now you're probably only going to be using the command type of text. This is called an enumeration, so that we input the correct value. We'll talk about enumerations if you get into the more advanced series and learn VisualStudio.net. But at any rate, we want to specify that we will be passing in a SQL statement. That's what that text phrase means there. And then the very next line, the command text, is the actual phrase, the actual command that we'll be passing in. So you see here we have update shipper, set company name equal to question mark, phone equal to question mark, where shipper ID equals the question mark. So this is a way of specifying parameters that we can use just question marks, and then we will add new parameter objects in code, not using a visual designer, as long as those parameters are added in the correct order. The order dictated by the order in this update statement will be all set. And this will work just fine. So this is roughly the equivalent to having added, for example, company name. Now I happen to know that that will not work here, that this syntax, the approach that we're taking, demands that we use this question mark syntax. Okay, so I've already alluded to this a little bit. Here I create 3 new OLEDB parameter objects, P1, P2, and P3. And in the constructor for each of these new parameter objects, I pass in the name of the parameter, its data type, the size, and then also what the default field is. Now we won't be using any of that, but it's good to flesh out all this information. So here again, creating the second one, passing in phone, varchar, and then finally shipper ID with a data type of integer. Next, I set the values for each of my parameters. So my company name parameter should contain the value currently stored within my company name private member variable. Same thing is true for my second parameter, which will contain the private member variable value for the phone, and finally for shipper ID. And then once I've done that, I'm going to add each of these parameter objects to the collection of parameters that belongs to my cmdUpdate object. Okay, so this might be a little bit foreign, but just think through it. All I need to do is populate a collection of parameters. So I create 3 objects, each of them represent a parameter. I populate the value for each of those objects, and then I add each of those objects to a larger collection of parameters that's managed by my command object. Okay, then this should look very familiar. I open a connection, I execute my command, and then I close the connection. This would then insert that record into, or I'm sorry, update that record in the database. The next thing that I need to do then is to write the code for my save button. So I need to connect it all together. Okay, so what I'm going to do is whenever somebody clicks on the save button, I'm going to pop up a message box that says, "Are you sure you want to save your changes?" And it'll have two buttons, a yes, no button, and it'll have a question icon, and at the very top it'll ask save changes in the little title bar. So that's what all of that means. I've used some of the additional parameters in this overloaded show method on the message box object. Now what I can also do is retrieve back whatever the user clicked on. So if they click the yes button, I want to know that. If they click the no button, I want to know that. So I can create a dialog result object, and then my messagebox.show will return an instance of that object, whether that object's value will be yes or no, true or false, or cancel, or whatever the other values that are valid within a dialog result. So look at what I do here. If my result object equals dialog result.yes, so if they agree to saving their changes, then I'm going to call my SafeShipper method that I just created a moment ago, which will then delegate to either an insert or an update. Additionally, what I want to do then is display the new shipper ID that's created as a result of inserting a new record into the database, if I am indeed inserting a record. And now I want to disable the save button. Now you'll see that we never really enabled the save button, nor have we ever taken the values from the text boxes and updated our shipper object with them. So this is how we're going to do that. I'm going to go back here, and each of these text boxes have an event called text changed. So whenever the text changes, what we're going to do is update that property on our shipper object and enable our save button, because our record is now essentially dirty. So to do that, I'm just going to double click on each text box in order to get the text changed event. Then I'm going to paste the code that I just explained a moment ago. So these three are very similar. Let's just go through one of them, the shipper ID. And so I'm going to, whenever somebody types in a new shipper ID, I want to know that. I'm going to capture that event. I'm going to set the shipper ID property of the shipper object to whatever the user typed in. In this case, I'm going to parse it into an integer. And then I'm going to enable the save button. Same thing is true for company name text box and the phone text box as well. So let's run the application now that we've made all these changes. Looks like we've got it to compile, so that's always a good first sign. I'm going to type in the number 2, click my find button. I find United Package. Now here's the moment of truth. I'm going to just add an S onto the end of this company name. When I do, the save button should be enabled, and it is. And I'm going to click the save button. It asks me, are you sure you want to save your changes? I'm going to select yes. And then I'm going to shut down my application. I'm going to open up my connection to my shipper table, and I indeed look at there is an S on the end of United Packages. So I have successfully updated the data in my database. Great. So the next thing I want to do is enable that new button, and that should essentially just clear everything out, create a new shipper object, or basically remove everything from the existing shipper object, just create a new reference to a new object and hold that new reference. Then just basically blank out all the text fields and then set the state appropriately. So let's go here and double click on our new button and then paste in some code, and you can see that's exactly what we do. In this line of code, I'm getting a reference to a new shipper object I'll use that new shipper object, which should have a shipper ID of 0, a company name, and a phone number that are blank strings. So I'm going to put those, essentially clearing out the text fields on my form, and then I'm going to disable the delete and the save buttons in order to kind of give my users a visual cue of what needs to happen next. Now the save should work the same. When I start typing in, it should fire off each of these text change events, and when I click the save button, it should call save shipper. Again, save shipper is going to look at the shipper ID. If it's 0, then it's going to try and insert the record. So let's run this and see if that actually works. So I'm going to click new, gives me a shipper ID of 0. My company name is going to be Bob's Shipping, and my phone number is going to be 123-456-7890. And I'm going to click Save. Are you sure you want to save your changes? Yes. Okay. Now let's take a look at our database to see if we have a new shipper there. And indeed we do. Bob's Shipping, shipper number 8, and there's the phone number. So that seems to work just fine. Okay, one of the last things that I need to do is to implement my delete button. So I'm going to go back to my shipper code and add one last method. And this one should look very obvious what we're doing. First of all, we're using our delete command. We're going to reference one of the parameters in the parameters collection called shipper ID, and we're going to pass in the value shipper ID from our private member variable. I'm going to open a connection, and then I'm going to simply execute that command and then close the connection. So let's now implement this in our delete button. And this is going to look very familiar to our save button. First of all, we're going to ask, are you sure you want to delete this shipper? Yes or no? If it's yes, then we're going to call our delete shipper method. Then we'll clear out all of the text boxes and reset the state. So you'll see that all of the real hard work is done by our shipper class. That our form only knows enough about the problem to display information on screen. Otherwise, it leaves all the hard work, all the saving of information to the database to our shipper class, our shipper component that we created. So let's go ahead and run our application. This time we'll type in a shipper ID of 8, we'll click Find, and now we'll click our delete button. Are you sure you want to delete this shipper? Yes. Unfortunately, it looks like I have a little bit of a problem here. And so I would just need to work through that. Maybe that's a good extra credit exercise for you. The unfortunate thing about the text changed events is that they happen even when the user is not typing keys on the keyboard. There's actually a better event that we can use than text changed, and that is key press event. However, this will work for the time being, at least for the purpose of explaining the structure of the application. That's what we really wanted to focus on, delegating all the responsibility of insert, update, and deleting records from a database to a separate component. That's the only job of that component, to manage that data. So we learned quite a bit in this lesson about how to create a more professional application. We were able to separate out the business rules that worked with the database and determined when to save or when to update. We separated all that out into its own class so that we'd have some separation between the business logic and the user interface, and then also the data or the data access. Additionally, we introduced some state management so that we can guide the user based on the current state of the data. But most importantly, we just demonstrated how to insert, update, and delete data using the parameters collection of the command objects. And we also used that collection editor to add parameters, define some parameters for the command objects. And then we also were able to, within just using our code, create a command object and populate its parameters from values that were in our object. So we did quite a bit here, and I hope this lesson was helpful to you. Don't forget to do all the readings and the lesson exercises so that you can get really strong on these concepts, because you'll be seeing these over and over again throughout your career as a programmer. Thank you.